Imagine an English beach in the clear, quiet hours of morning. The promenade, if there is one, has not yet grown busy. Lodging house curtains remain drawn, gulls cross a pale sky, and a long band of damp sand reflects the light. Near the water stands an object that seems to belong partly to the shore and partly to the street, a little wooden room raised on wheels. Tonight, we will spend some time with that room. We will look closely at its boards and steps, then follow the ideas that brought people to the sea in search of health. We will visit the early resort shore, consider how such a cabin could be moved, and pause within its shaded interior, where privacy had to be made on a beach open to wind and view. There is no need to remember names or dates. This is a slow journey through ordinary arrangements, a door closing, a wheel turning, a printed page resting beside a window. The sea keeps its own unhurried rhythm in the background. For now, we begin on dry sand, before the cabin moves at all. At first sight, a bathing machine can be difficult to place. It resembles a hut, but a hut is expected to remain still. It resembles a carriage, but its purpose is not to carry a traveler down a road. It is a room whose journey is only a short one, from the upper beach toward the water and back again. Its destination may be visible from the moment its door is opened. The safest way to understand it is not to search for one perfect model. Designs differed between places and periods. Surviving pictures show variation, and surviving objects remind us that a convenient modern diagram can smooth away differences that mattered in practice. Some machines appear plain and box-like. Others have more carefully finished woodwork. The arrangement of screens, curtains, wheels, doors, and steps could change. Methods of moving them could change as well. The family resemblance is useful, but it should not become a rigid formula. Many were wooden cabins mounted on wheels. That simple description contains nearly the whole idea. Timber provided walls, roof, and floor, enclosing enough space for a person to remove ordinary clothes and prepare for the water. Wheels allowed that enclosed space to approach the sea. A door admitted the bather from the beach, while the seaward end could provide steps for descent. A small window might admit a little daylight without turning the cabin into a display case. Walk around one in imagination, without assigning it dimensions that may not fit another. The boards are sun-warmed on the dry side. Nearer the lower edges, repeated contact with wet sand and spray has darkened the wood. Metal fittings carry a faint roughness from salt air. Hinges have practical work to do, and so do latches. The wheels must bear the cabin's weight over a surface that is neither a proper road nor entirely firm ground. Those wheels give the machine its peculiar character. On a carriage, wheels promise distance. Here, they promise adjustment. The shoreline shifts through the day, and the water does not wait at a fixed platform. A movable cabin could be placed in relation to the changing edge of the sea. It could begin higher on the beach, where entry from shore was easier, and then be taken toward the shallows. Later it could return, carrying the privacy of its walls back with it. Contemporary visual evidence often makes the wheels conspicuous. They may seem surprisingly large beneath a cabin that is otherwise modest. Large wheels are understandable on sand and uneven ground, though it would be unwise to treat one pictured arrangement as a universal standard. Their rims meet packed sand, loose sand, pebbles, channels left by the retreating tide, and perhaps shallow water. Each beach presents a different small problem of traction and balance. The cabin itself is more than a container. It divides one stage of the bathing experience from another. On the landward side are ordinary clothes, public arrival, and the social world of the resort. On the seaward side are steps, surf, and immersion. Within the walls lies a pause between them. A visitor who entered from the beach did not have to change in an exposed shelter or cross the full strand dressed for bathing. The room traveled with the bather toward the place where it was needed. A window, where present, softened the darkness. It need not have been large to be useful. Inside a narrow wooden chamber, a small square of coastal light would help someone find fastenings, arrange garments, and keep dry belongings apart from wet ones. Yet the window also expresses the balance at the heart of the design: admit light, but preserve seclusion. The bathing machine was not built for a broad view from within. The wide horizon belonged outside. At the water-facing end, steps connected floor level to beach or sea. Their number and form were not necessarily the same from machine to machine. What matters is their function. A raised-wheeled cabin could not simply open at ground level like a garden shed. The bather needed a manageable way down. When water reached the lower part of the machine, those steps became the threshold between an enclosed dry space and moving water. Some examples had curtains or an awning around the seaward descent. Such screening extended the private interior beyond the solid walls. Canvas could make a temporary little passage, neither fully cabin nor fully open beach. It moved in the wind, unlike the boards, and its effectiveness depended on its arrangement and the weather. We should not imagine that every machine possessed an identical hood, or that one device and one name covered all forms of screening. Curtains were features of particular machines, not a license to standardize every shore. One especially well-preserved example associated with Queen Victoria at Osborne includes a door, a small window, steps at the opposite end, and curtains that shielded the descent. It is valuable because it survives as an object rather than only as a line in a description. Yet it remains a particular royal machine in a particular setting. Its fittings help us see what was possible. They do not turn it into the compulsory pattern for every commercial bathing place. The same caution applies to finish and decoration. A surviving elite object may have received care unlike a hard-working resort machine exposed season after season to damp, grit, and many users. A print may emphasize comic bulk, elegance, awkwardness, or novelty according to the artist's purpose. Object and picture each tell something, but neither alone gives us an average cabin for the whole English coast. It is therefore helpful to notice the machine as a collection of practical decisions. Wood gives enclosure. The raised floor keeps the interior above the immediate surface. Wheels allow movement. Steps manage the change in height. A window negotiates light and privacy. Curtains, where used, extend concealment toward the sea. None of these parts is mysterious. Their combination is what appears strange to us, because modern beachgoers usually separate changing facilities from movement into the water. To people who encountered such machines as familiar resort equipment, the sight may have seemed less extraordinary. Rows of wheeled cabins could become part of the working beach, as expected as boats, baskets, or chairs. Attendants understood how to position them. Visitors knew that the little door offered a route from respectable public appearance to bathing. What surprises us was, for them, part of an organized service. Still, even familiarity would not remove the sensory presence of the thing. A hollow wooden structure amplifies knocks and footfalls. The latch sounds close at hand. Wind presses lightly at the joints. When the machine begins to move, the room answers with small shifts, a creak from the frame, a tremor through the floor, the muted grind of wheels below. Through the small window, the level of sand and sky changes. For the moment, let it remain stationary. Its shaded interior waits behind the door, and the steps face the distant line of water. Before asking exactly how a bather used it, we need to understand why increasing numbers of visitors wanted to enter the sea at all. The answer begins not with holiday postcards, but with medical pages, old theories of the body, and a new attention to salt water. The sea did not suddenly appear in the 18th century. Fishing communities, sailors, coastal traders, and residents had always lived beside it in ways that did not depend on fashionable medicine. What changed was the attention given to sea water by physicians and patients who understood health through the theories of their own period. The coast could be presented not merely as an edge of the country, but as a place of treatment. To enter that world, picture a printed medical volume lying open in a quiet room. Beyond the glass, if the room is near the shore, surf sounds at a distance. On the page, the sea is translated into argument. Its salt, coldness, motion, and supposed effects are fitted into contemporary explanations of disease. The living, irregular water outside becomes a substance that can be recommended, discussed, and incorporated into a regimen. 18th-century medicine used categories and assumptions that do not map neatly onto modern diagnosis. Physicians might connect symptoms through ideas about bodily tone, circulation, glands, fibers, humors, or weakness. Treatments could aim to stimulate, strengthen, cool, purge, or restore balance according to those frameworks. When sea water was promoted, it entered this older medical landscape. Its value was asserted within the knowledge and uncertainty of the time. Richard Russell is closely associated with this medical fashion. His work on the use of sea water discussed conditions then understood as glandular diseases and advocated marine treatment for an array of complaints. The work is evidence that a physician made a sustained case for sea water and that readers could encounter that case in print. It is not evidence that the prescriptions meet present standards of clinical proof, and it should never be offered as health guidance now. Russell also should not be made into a solitary creator of the seaside. Coasts had histories before his writing, and resorts emerged from many influences. Patients, practitioners, local businesses, travel habits, existing spa traditions, and social fashion all played roles. A printed medical argument could strengthen interest and give it authority without single-handedly inventing every journey, every bathing custom, or every town's development. For a patient of the period, however, a physician's recommendation could give the shoreline a special seriousness. A trip to the coast might involve effort, expense, and absence from home. It could be planned around advice rather than spontaneous amusement. The water's chill, which might otherwise discourage entry, could be interpreted as part of its power. Salt taste and forceful movement could seem evidence of potency. Discomfort was not necessarily proof that a treatment lacked value. Under some theories, it might be taken as a sign that the body had been acted upon. Seawater treatment could involve more than bathing. Historical advocacy included drinking sea water as well as entering it, though practices and prescriptions varied. That detail reminds us how distant the medical setting can be from the modern image of a refreshing swim. The patient was not always imagined as an athlete moving freely for pleasure. The sea might be approached as a dose, an ordeal, a course, or one element in a broader routine. The idea of a regimen matters. Medical travel often brought attention to timing, repetition, diet, air, exercise, and supervision, not simply a single dramatic plunge. The coast offered an environment as well as a substance. Its wind, open horizon, and distance from ordinary life could be folded into expectations of recovery. Even when the sea was central, the journey altered daily routine in many other ways. There was already a model for traveling in pursuit of health, the inland spa. Mineral springs had long attracted visitors who drank waters, bathed, consulted practitioners, walked, lodged, and socialized. The seaside could borrow something from this culture. Salt water was different from a spring, and the shore was not simply a spa moved outward, but familiar habits of health travel made the new destination easier to imagine. Treatment and sociability could occupy the same day. This mixture produced a productive ambiguity. A visitor could be a patient and a guest, obedient to medical advice and attentive to company. Morning bathing might be followed by meals, calls, reading, music, walking, or conversation. A place known for remedies could also become fashionable. People did not need identical motives. One person might arrive with a specific complaint, another with general hopes of strengthening, and another because the coast had become an approved place to spend part of the season. Printed culture helped these ideas travel. A medical treatise did not have to be read by every eventual bather to influence expectations. Physicians read and responded to one another. Summaries circulated. Advice passed through families and acquaintances. Guidebooks and local promotion could present bathing as an established practice. By the time a visitor stood before the sea, the water might already have acquired a reputation assembled from many pages and conversations. The language of cure deserves particular care. To say that people sought a cure is a historical statement about their hopes. To say that sea bathing cured the conditions claimed would be a modern medical assertion for which this evidence does not suffice. The difference is small in grammar and enormous in meaning. We can follow the confidence of period writers without adopting it. Nor did every 18th-century person accept every recommendation. Medical culture contained disagreement, changing fashion, individual caution, and failed hopes. Some patients may have found the experience invigorating, others may have disliked it, still others may have valued the journey in company more than the water. The surviving printed argument often speaks more firmly than lived experience must have done. A prescription on a page is orderly. A cold, restless sea is not. That disorder created practical needs. If respectable visitors were to approach the water as patients, the beach required some organization. They needed places to lodge and people to serve them. They needed advice about where and how bathing occurred. They might need assistance with waves and footing. They also needed a way to reconcile bodily exposure with the expectations of public conduct. Here the bathing machine begins to make sense. It was not a medical instrument in the narrow way a surgeon's tool is an instrument. Its boards did not provide the supposed therapeutic force, the sea did. Yet it enabled a prescribed encounter with the water under socially acceptable conditions. It converted a difficult open shoreline into a sequence that could be managed: enter an enclosure, change, move toward the sea, descend, return. The machine also gave the emerging practice a visible structure. A line of cabin suggested that bathing was not an eccentric act performed without support. It was a service with equipment and workers. The beach could accommodate visitors who were unused to undressing near others or uncertain in the surf. Medicine supplied one reason to come, organization made arrival less bewildering. Over time, pleasure and health became thoroughly entangled at the seaside. We should resist arranging them in a simple order, as though treatment came first and enjoyment replaced it on one date. A health journey could contain pleasure from the beginning. A holidaymaker could continue to use therapeutic language. Fashion could sustain a practice after its medical reasoning shifted. Different visitors, resorts, and decades produced different combinations. Close the medical book now, leaving its claims in their historical setting. Outside, the sea has not changed, but the reader's interpretation of it has. Water once viewed mainly as hazard, workplace, or boundary can also be imagined as a remedy. With that expectation packed beside ordinary clothes, travelers begin to make their way toward coastal towns, where an early resort world is taking shape before the great age of railway excursions. A resort is not made by water alone. The sea may provide the attraction, but visitors need roofs, meals, directions, transport, and a social setting in which their journey seems intelligible. Along parts of the English coast, these elements gathered gradually. By the later 18th and early 19th centuries, travel literature could guide readers through places associated with sea bathing, helping to turn scattered local knowledge into an itinerary. Period guidebooks are quiet but revealing objects. Their paper world contains roads, distances, notable buildings, accommodations, landscapes, and reasons to stop. A traveler consulting one did not see the coast as an abstract line on a map. It appeared as a chain of destinations approached by particular routes. The guide helped answer the practical question that follows every recommendation to seek the sea: where, precisely, should one go? Thomas Fisher's Kentish Traveller's Companion, published in 1776, belongs to this culture of directed travel and is associated with accounts of bathing practice at Kentish resorts. Wally Chamberlain Olton's early 19th century itinerary likewise represents the expanding literature of movement through England. Their existence supports a broad point: sea bathing places were being described to travelers before railways transformed access. Exact local details require exact checking, so we need not make the book say more than the evidence allows. Imagine a traveler arriving by road rather than stepping from a train. The final approach is measured through changing ground, roadside buildings, and glimpses of sky. Luggage must be carried. Weather affects progress. The journey itself may reinforce the sense that the coast is a place apart from home. Then the road enters a town, salt air becomes noticeable, and between roofs there is suddenly open brightness. The early resort shore was both local workplace and visitor destination. Boats, nets, carts, fish, repair work, and coastal trade did not vanish when bathers arrived. The beach could hold overlapping uses, some old and some newly fashionable. A visitor seeking health entered a place where residents already made their living. The bathing machine belonged to this mixed economy, an unusual object for the newcomer, a piece of working equipment for those who handled it. Lodging was fundamental. A course of bathing or an extended coastal stay required more than a room for one night. Windows looked toward streets or water, clothing had to be stored, meals had to be arranged. Owners and servants responded to seasonal demand. The visitor's experience of the sea was framed by domestic interiors, stairs, breakfast tables, washstands, curtains, and by the daily walk or ride down to the shore. Morning was especially important because bathing practices could shape the timetable of a day. Without inventing one standard hour or session, we can picture a town beginning work around its visitors. Doors open. Attendants prepare equipment. Horses and carts may move for many unrelated purposes. On the beach, machines stand ready or are positioned according to local practice and the state of the water. The scene is orderly in some places, improvised in others, and always subject to weather. Notices and signs translate custom into instruction. A newcomer needs to know where a service is obtained and which part of the shore is used. Some information comes from a lodging keeper or companion, some from printed guidance, some from observing what everyone else seems to do. Later evidence preserves local rules and formal notices, but even before considering regulation, the beach had to communicate its arrangements. A row of cabins, a waiting attendant, and a well-used track over sand could guide without words. The resort also offered an audience. Health practices performed in fashionable settings acquire social meanings beyond treatment. Who has arrived, where they lodge, when they walk, and with whom they appear can matter. Bathing itself may be screened, but the approach to it is visible. The little cabin protects the changing body while also announcing that its occupant participates in coastal fashion. That apparent contradiction is central to seaside culture. Privacy did not mean invisibility from beginning to end. Visitors could be conspicuous as visitors while concealing particular moments. A bathing machine allowed both. One might be seen entering a cabin from the public beach, yet remain hidden while changing and descending. The service made bodily privacy compatible with social presence. Businesses could grow around these patterns without following a single national plan. Lodging houses, bathing services, transport providers, food sellers, and other trades responded to local opportunity. Existing towns had different shorelines, economies, landowners, and traditions. One broad phrase, the English seaside resort, must not erase those differences. Margate was not every coast, nor was any other celebrated destination. The shape of a beach mattered. A broad, gently sloping strand presented one set of possibilities for wheeled cabins. Shingle, steep gradients, rocks, or restricted access presented others. Tides altered usable space. Local methods developed in response. This is one reason not to assign the same machinery and procedure everywhere. A bathing machine was an adaptable idea rather than a nationally standardized vehicle. So too was the clientele varied. Fashionable society appears prominently in resort history because it left plentiful commentary and images, but services also changed as access widened and coastal visiting expanded. The 18th century patient, the family visitor, the curious traveler, and the later holiday crowd do not fit one portrait. Even within a single season, motives and means could differ. Railways would eventually enlarge and accelerate these movements, but they did not create coastal culture from nothing. Resorts had histories before the locomotive arrived. Roads, coaches, private carriages, boats, and local transport had already connected travelers with the shore. Medical reputation, spa habits, landscape appreciation, sociability, and commercial adaptation were already at work. The railway belongs to a later chapter of expansion, not to an origin story in which an empty beach suddenly becomes a resort. This pre-rail history changes the pace at which we imagine the town. Arrival is slower, stays may be shaped by the effort of travel, and printed itineraries carry practical authority. News of a destination moves through books, advertisements, letters, and recommendation. Improvements accumulate unevenly. A new lodging house, a better road, additional bathing equipment, or a more formal arrangement on the beach can each alter the visitor's experience without constituting one dramatic founding moment. Guidebooks both record and encourage this development. Once a place appears within a traveler's mental map, further visitors can arrive with expectations already formed. They expect sea air, bathing, scenery, or company. Local providers, in turn, can shape services around those expectations. Description and destination reinforce one another. Yet the books should not draw our eyes entirely away from physical labor. Someone cleans and repairs the cabin. Someone monitors its position. Sand works into moving parts, salt and damp trouble wood and iron. Steps grow wet. Curtains need attention. A resort's refined image rests upon repeated ordinary tasks, many of them carried out early or out of the visitor's focus. Stand for a moment at a lodging house window and look toward the morning beach. Figures move between town and shore. Below, the bathing machines appear small against the broad water, though each is large enough to enclose a person. The guidebook has brought the traveler to this view. The town has provided the room, road, and service. Now the practical question comes forward: how does one move a wooden cabin over sand and place it safely near the waves? A bathing machine is simple in concept, but simplicity does not mean weightlessness. Timber walls, roof, floor, fittings, steps, axle, and wheels together form a substantial object. Add a bather and belongings, then place the whole structure on a sloping, yielding beach. The short journey to the water becomes a small exercise in engineering. Begin with the frame. It must hold its shape while stationary and while moving. A cabin that twists badly over uneven ground would be uncomfortable and difficult to use. The floor needs to support a standing person. Door and steps need firm attachment. The axle and wheel arrangement must carry the load. We do not need a universal blueprint to recognize these demands, they arise from the purpose of the object itself. Wood is well suited to building an enclosed room, but the shore is severe on materials. Moisture enters joints. Salt settles on metal. Sand abrades surfaces and works around rims and bearings. Sun and wind dry one face while spray wets another. Maintenance was therefore not an ornamental concern. A machine might look picturesque from a distance while requiring close, repetitive care from those who operated it. The wheels had to meet ground that changed from place to place and hour to hour. Higher sand might be loose and deeply marked by feet. Lower sand could be firmer, though crossed by runnels. Pebbles resist in another way. The receding sea leaves ridges, pools, weed, and small obstacles. A route that worked at one state of tide might not be equally convenient later. Surviving images and descriptions document variation in how machines were moved. In different settings, human attendants, animals, ropes, shafts, or other arrangements might be involved. But the prevalence of any one method should not be guessed. There was no necessity for every resort to solve the problem identically, and no reason to force all pictured mechanisms into a single sequence. Where an animal supplied power, that fact tells us about traction and labor, but it does not establish that horses moved every machine. Where ropes appear, they show one practical system, not a universal fixed apparatus. Where people push or guide, their exact number and technique depend on the object and beach before them. The evidence invites a language of possibilities tied to observed cases, not a confident nationwide recipe. Guidance was as important as force. A heavy cabin must not merely move, it must move in the intended direction and stop in a suitable position. The attendant's knowledge of the shore mattered. A wheel entering a soft patch or channel could tilt the room. A door or steps needed to face correctly. The water itself moved while the machine was being placed, so judgment remained part of the work. Inside, movement would be felt more intimately than it looked from outside. The floor might incline and settle. Clothing hung or folded within would respond to each small jolt. Light from a window shifts as the cabin changes position. The bather hears the frame, wheels, and perhaps voices outside, but may see little of the actual operation. Trust in the workers and equipment is built into the arrangement. This does not mean every ride was alarming. Familiar equipment, managed slowly on a known beach, could turn the movement into routine. The machine was not designed for speed. Its useful qualities were enclosure, controlled placement, and return. A cautious pace protected structure and occupant alike. The distance might be modest, yet each revolution of the wheels carried a private room into a more difficult environment. As the cabin neared the water, resistance changed again. Wet sand may support wheels differently from dry sand. Shallow waves move around the lower parts. The chosen position had to make the sea accessible without placing the whole apparatus heedlessly at the mercy of surf. Conditions varied day by day. Calm water and rougher water could not be treated as the same workplace. The axle is easy to overlook because it sits beneath the more visually memorable cabin. Yet it translates pulling or pushing into movement and keeps the body raised. Iron components, wheel hubs, and timber connections bear strain each time the machine starts, stops, or crosses uneven ground. A squeak or groan is not merely atmosphere, it is the sound of load moving through materials. The steps present their own engineering problem. They must be usable when the machine stands on sand and when water approaches. They can become slippery. They need to carry a person who may be encumbered by bathing clothes and uncertain of footing. Some visual records show assistants near the machine, reminding us that design and human support work together. The object alone did not eliminate risk or awkwardness. Nor did it eliminate work after the bather returned. Wetness travels upward on garments and feet. Sand clings. The interior may need airing or cleaning before another use. A curtain exposed to spray remains damp. Hinges and steps require inspection. The machine's repeated trips make bathing possible for visitors by transferring inconvenience to a cycle of maintenance handled by operators. The beach service therefore depended upon several kinds of knowledge. Carpentry and repair kept the cabin sound. Experience with wheels, harness, ropes, or guiding methods kept it mobile. Familiarity with tides and ground helped determine placement. Attention to bathers helped coordinate when the machine should move and when assistance was needed. The curious hut belonged to a system of skills. It also occupied space. Multiple machines needed room to wait, travel, and stand without obstructing one another. Local arrangements might separate areas or organize rows. Other beach users still required passage. At a busy resort, moving one cabin was part of a larger choreography whose details could differ by town and period. From farther up the beach, this work might look almost stately. A box moves slowly down a pale slope. Its wheels leave lines behind it. An attendant walks beside or behind. Nothing in the scene resembles rapid transport. Yet from close by there are constant adjustments, a hand on wood, a rope taking strain in a documented arrangement, a wheel pressing into damp sand, a pause before the next few feet. Avoiding a single mechanical story makes the history more, not less, interesting. Local adaptation becomes visible. A method suited to one shore may be unnecessary or impractical on another. Equipment may change over decades. Operators may alter how an older cabin is used. The category, bathing machine, names a purpose and a recognizable form while allowing many practical solutions beneath it. Eventually the movement ends. The cabin rests near enough to the water for its seaward exit to be useful. The force that brought it there, human, animal, rope-assisted, or another locally documented arrangement, falls quiet. Now the machine's engineering recedes into the background, and its social purpose comes forward. A door is closed, dry clothes are set aside, and an open beach is divided by thin boards and moving canvas into public and private space. A beach offers almost no natural privacy. Its horizon is broad, its ground mostly open, and its visitors can see one another from a considerable distance. For sea bathing to fit expectations of respectability, privacy had to be constructed. The bathing machine did this in a literal sense. It placed walls, a roof, and a closable door where the shore itself provided none. Enter the cabin while it is still above the waterline. The bright beach disappears when the door closes. Inside, light comes through a small window or through narrow gaps around fittings. Timber smell mingles with salt and the faint dampness left by earlier use. The room need not be luxurious to change the meaning of undressing. For walls transform an exposed act into a private one. The distinction is not merely between clothed and unclothed bodies. Ordinary street or resort clothing could be complicated to remove and arrange. Dry garments needed protection from wet sand and spray. Personal belongings had to remain somewhere while the bather entered the sea. The cabin served as changing room, temporary cupboard, and private threshold all at once. Its mobility made that privacy continuous in a way a stationary shelter could not. If a visitor changed in a fixed building high on shore, reaching the sea might require crossing open sand in bathing dress. The machine allowed the enclosed room to travel closer to the water. The distance between private changing and immersion could be shortened, though the exact arrangement varied. At the seaward end, steps extended the passage. On some machines, curtains or an awning screened descent. The solid cabin ended, but concealment continued briefly in cloth. Canvas lifted and settled with the wind, creating a less certain boundary than timber. It was practical precisely because it could surround a space that remained open to water below. Not every screen should be given one standard form or described as though national law required it. The evidence shows curtains on particular examples, including Queen Victoria's surviving Osborne machine, and visual records show different arrangements. Resort, period, clientele, and local custom all matter. Privacy was an aim pursued through variable equipment, not a single patented silhouette repeated unchanged along the coast. The idea of privacy itself also shifted. What a community considered acceptable on the beach depended on gender conventions, clothing, class expectations, local rules, and date. Conduct that drew little comment in one setting might be restricted in another. Later regulations could formalize practices that had previously rested on custom, or attempt to settle disputes produced by a busier shore. One surviving notice from Yarmouth imposed a penalty for bathing outside a machine or hut on specified portions of beach. It offers firm evidence of local regulation. Its value lies in its specificity. A particular authority governed particular areas. It does not prove that the same penalty, wording, or arrangement applied to every English resort. The shore was regulated locally, and those rules could differ. Scarborough evidence supplies another local example from a later 19th century context. Bylaws reported from around 1861 included a prohibition on naked bathing, restricted bathing in part of the shore to machines, and set aside areas for men's and women's machines. Later local provisions addressed distance between bathers of opposite sexes and required certain forms of bathing dress. These details illuminate Scarborough, they are not a national code in miniature. Such regulations reveal how privacy extended beyond the cabin walls. Authorities could organize space by assigning sections of shore, separating equipment, or defining acceptable appearance and distance. In this sense, the beach itself became a set of invisible rooms. A painted or written notice, a customary boundary, and a row of machines could divide open sand without erecting permanent walls. Gender separation was likewise neither timeless nor perfectly uniform. Images, local records, and later histories show that conventions changed. It is unsafe to say that all men followed one practice, all women another, or that mixed bathing arrived everywhere on a single date. The stronger historical point is that resorts negotiated who could bathe where, under what degree of concealment, and in what clothing. The machine helped those negotiations because it hid the process of preparation. Its user could remain part of a public resort while withholding a private interval from view. But privacy was not complete isolation. An attendant might wait outside. Workers moved the cabin. Other visitors knew it was occupied. Sounds passed through wood, and a small window admitted awareness of the surrounding day. The machine offered seclusion within a shared service. That balance may have reassured some bathers and constrained others. Enclosure can feel protective, but a dim narrow room can also feel confining. The machine's movement was controlled from outside. A user might depend on signals or routine to know when the seaward door could be opened. We should not assign one emotion to every bather. The same arrangement could seem dignified, awkward, comforting, or cumbersome according to experience. Etiquette filled spaces that law did not. A notice could state a prohibition, but ordinary conduct depended on habits, where one waited, which door one used, when attendants approached, how long belongings remained inside, and how people avoided intruding upon one another. These details were learned locally. Regular visitors and workers would understand them more readily than a newcomer holding a guidebook. Privacy also had a visible material cost. Cabins had to be built, stored, maintained, and moved. Curtains had to be hung and dried. Space had to be allocated. Workers had to coordinate use. Respectability was not an abstract mood laid over the beach, it was produced through timber, canvas, labor, and rules. The machine made a social expectation into an object heavy enough to leave wool tracks. Those tracks led in two directions. Toward the water, the cabin protected transition from everyday appearance to bathing. Returning shoreward, it allowed the bather to become publicly dressed again before stepping out. The same walls enclosed both transformations. Dry clothing waited in the dimness while the sea was entered, and afterward the cabin offered a place to remove what had become wet and heavy. Here the question of clothing comes very close, but it deserves its own careful attention. Garments did not remain fixed across the long life of bathing machines. They differed by place, gender, social setting, and decade, and local rules sometimes addressed them directly. As bathing dress changed, so did the practical value of crossing the beach unseen. For now, the seaward curtain settles against the frame. Outside it lies open water, inside lie folded clothes, fastenings, and the subdued light of the small window. To understand what happened next, we must look not only at the cabin that concealed the bather, but at the garments the bather carried into the sea. Open the cabin door in imagination, but only a little, because this is a room intended for changing. On a narrow bench lies a small arrangement of clothing, dry garments folded away from the damp boards, a bathing dress ready to be put on, perhaps laces or buttons waiting for fingers that have already begun to feel the coolness of the morning. The beach outside is broad and public. Inside, clothing creates another kind of shelter, one worn upon the body after the wooden shelter has been left behind. It would be convenient if there were one unmistakable English bathing costume that belonged to the age of the bathing machine. There was not. The machines remained in use through generations in which clothing, beaches, and expectations all changed. What appeared suitable in one town or decade might look old-fashioned in another. What a woman wore cannot safely be inferred from what a man wore, and neither can be turned into a rule for every class or every resort. Images survive, garments are described, and local regulations occasionally become specific, but together they offer a collection of views rather than a single uniform. English visual evidence shows women near bathing machines in garments made for entering the water. Such records allow us to notice broad qualities: the body is covered, cloth extends over the torso and limbs, the clothing looks substantial by the standards of a modern swimming beach. Yet an image must be treated as one moment. Its date, setting, and purpose matter. An artist may simplify cloth or sharpen a comic effect. A photograph records particular people, not an entire nation. Even a carefully catalogued scene does not tell us what everyone beyond its frame had chosen to wear. This caution does not leave the subject empty. It makes the surviving details more interesting. Bathing clothing had practical work to do, even when fashion and respectability placed heavy demands upon it. It needed to stay upon a moving body. It had to endure salt water, wet sand, and repeated drying. Fastenings mattered. So did the weight of fabric after immersion. Wool, often associated with historical bathing dress, can feel reassuringly solid when dry and considerably heavier when saturated. A garment that hangs neatly from the shoulders inside the cabin may pull and cling once the sea has entered every fiber. Think of the small sounds before the bather goes out. A button meets its hole. A lace is drawn, checked, and tied. Dry street clothes are placed safely on the bench rather than dropped upon the floor. Stockings, skirts, a coat, or other ordinary layers must be managed in the confined interior, though the exact collection naturally depends upon the wearer and the date. The cabin gives room enough for the transformation, but not abundance. An elbow may brush the wall. Timber may catch a loose edge of cloth. The little window gives pale light while the sea beyond it remains unseen. For many women, coverage was part of the very reason a bathing machine was useful. The wearer could remove street clothing in private, put on clothing judged suitable for bathing, and approach the water without making the entire change in public. The costume and machine therefore worked together. One covered the body, the other screened the moment of changing and, where curtains or another arrangement existed, could also screen part of the descent. Neither should be treated as a complete answer to privacy on its own. Men's practice also resisted a simple national description. Stories about the old seaside often suggest that men everywhere bathed naked until a single wave of Victorian modesty covered them. The evidence does not support so broad a sentence. Customs differed, and local authorities sometimes intervened. At Scarborough, rules from around 1861 included a ban on naked bathing. Later local provisions required males over 12 to wear suitable drawers. Those are useful details precisely because they belong to a named place. They show that clothing could become a matter for local government, but they do not establish what every Englishman wore on every other shore. Scarborough's rules also specified gowns for females. Again, the term gives us a category rather than one universal design. A gown might change in line and decoration while remaining recognizably intended to cover. Local evidence from 1898 describes one costume with shoulder frills and white stripes. It is a wonderfully precise glimpse, decoration placed at the shoulder, pale lines interrupting the main fabric, a garment made not merely to conceal but also to be seen. Still, it is a Scarborough example from the late 19th century, not the costume of all English bathing women before or after that summer. The shoulder frills remind us that water did not suspend fashion. Bathing dress belonged to leisure, but leisure took place under the eyes of other people. Color, trimming, and cut could signal taste, means, age, or a willingness to follow a newer mode. A person might want a garment respectable enough for the shore and pleasing enough for a holiday, while also hoping it would not become impossible in the waves. Those aims did not always agree. The sea is indifferent to a decorative stripe. It pulls upon every layer equally. Gender conventions were powerful, but they were not motionless. By the 1890s, English accounts describe swimwear as sufficiently covering for changing expectations on some beaches, while appearing publicly and it was becoming more acceptable. The change was not instantaneous. A person might cross one stretch of sand confidently in bathing clothes while another place still insisted upon separation or screening. Older and newer habits could stand within sight of each other, much as movable machines and other changing facilities later did. Inside our cabin, the folded dry clothes remain one of the morning's most valuable comforts. Whatever the bathing costume looks like, it belongs to the wet portion of the day. The wearer knows that after the steps, the surf, and the return, there will be stockings or a shirt free of salt, an outer layer that has not dragged through water, perhaps a familiar collar or shawl. The little pile waits like a promise of warmth. We can now close the door without deciding that every woman wore the same gown or that every man followed the same custom. The evidence asks for a softer picture: English bathers clothed according to changing local expectations, personal means, gender conventions, and the fashions of their particular years. Some garments were ample, some decorated, some regulated in general terms, and all became more troublesome when wet. Beyond the cabin wall, another person waits whose work is not mainly with fabric or fashion, but with wheels, steps, uncertain footing, and the edge of the sea. A bathing machine may dominate the old image because it is large, geometric, and strange. Beside it, however, there is often a human figure. Sometimes that figure stands at the steps. Sometimes several people support a bather making the difficult passage from cabin to water. Their presence changes the machine from an isolated object into a service, and the beach from empty scenery into a workplace. At some resorts, attendants helped bathers negotiate the steps, the surf, and the prescribed plunge. That modest statement is the secure center of their history. It does not give us a national job description. It does not tell us that every client was treated in exactly the same way. It certainly does not justify attaching a dramatic biography to a worker whose life has not been securely traced. Yet it is enough to let us look closely at the skill concealed in a steady hand. Begin with the steps. They may appear simple when a machine is displayed on land, but their meaning changes at the water's edge. Timber can be wet. The lowest tread may be washed by a moving wave. A bathing garment can pull at the legs, and a bather may be nervous, cold, elderly, physically uncertain, or entirely new to the sea. An attendant standing nearby reads several things at once: the bather's balance, the next movement of water, the position of the machine, and the moment when support will help without becoming another obstacle. Contemporary visual records show assistance being given as people leave machines and enter the sea. In one such scene, 3 young women assist a larger woman stepping down. The image is valuable not because it permits us to invent their conversation, but because it makes the bodily cooperation unmistakable. Hands are needed. Weight shifts between people. The descent is not always a solitary, elegant walk into calm water. There could also be reluctance. Another period image includes a hesitant male bather watching from a machine while others are in the sea. We cannot diagnose his thoughts from the picture. Perhaps the water looks colder than expected, perhaps the scene was arranged for humor. What it does allow us to remember is that clients arrived with different levels of confidence. An attendant worked not only beside bodies but beside uncertainty. Instructions may have been brief and practical: where to place a foot, when to wait, when to move. We need not invent exact words to hear the nature of the exchange. The sea makes elaborate speeches unlikely. Wind carries sound away, wheels creak, and water breaks around the lower steps. Communication has to be clear enough to guide movement. A gesture toward the rail or an offered forearm may be more useful than any sentence. Where bathing was connected to a medical prescription, assistance could include helping the client carry out the expected immersion. 18th and 19th century beliefs about cold sea bathing belong to the medicine of their own periods, not to modern clinical advice. The attendant's role was practical within that historical framework. We should resist the colorful formula in which every bather was seized and repeatedly dunked by a formidable local character. Techniques varied, evidence is local, and memorable tales often become smoother with retelling than working life ever was. It is tempting to populate this chapter with famous names. Seaside history has preserved stories of celebrated bathing women and forceful dippers, sometimes accompanied by witty remarks, feats of strength, long careers, and encounters with distinguished visitors. Without local sources opened and checked, such anecdotes cannot carry this account. So we will leave the names aside. Anonymity here is not emptiness. It allows us to notice the many workers who performed necessary tasks without becoming characters in a legend. Nor will we assign them a wage. Pay might depend on town, employer, season, duties, gratuities, and date. A figure taken from one place could easily become a false standard for another. The sources available to us support the existence of assistance more firmly than they support an English wage scale. We can say that this was labor, often personal and physically demanding, without pretending to know what every pair of steady hands earned. Consider the physical stance required. Sand shifts beneath the feet. Water pushes first at the ankles and then with more force. Supporting another person means remaining balanced while their weight may arrive suddenly. A hand must be firm without alarming. The worker's own clothing must permit movement and endure dampness. Repetition makes the action familiar, but familiarity does not flatten every wave or make every client alike. Attendants also occupied an unusual social position. They entered moments of privacy without quite belonging to the bather's private world. They might wait outside while clothing changed, then come close enough to take an arm or support a body. The relationship required trust, but it was also a transaction within the resort economy. A visitor temporarily depended upon someone whose experience of the shore was far greater than their own. This dependence may have crossed class lines. A well-dressed client arriving from comfortable lodgings could possess more money and social standing, yet at the lower step the attendant possessed the useful knowledge. The sea briefly rearranged authority. Fine dry clothes folded inside could not teach balance in moving water. The worker, perhaps less visible in later accounts than the visitor, became the expert at precisely the moment expertise mattered. From a distance, a row of attendants may look as still as posts beside the cabins. Up close, waiting is part of the labor. One watches a door, a set of waves, a signal, another worker, or the progress of a bather already in the water. Then stillness becomes movement, a step forward, an arm extended, a careful retreat as the next wash reaches the wheels. The rhythm is made of attention punctuated by action. At the end of an encounter, the same difficult passage occurs in reverse. The bather returns wet, perhaps breathing harder, perhaps eager for the shelter of the cabin. Cloth clings and steps remain slippery. Assistance toward safety can matter as much as assistance outward. Then the door closes, and the attendant is outside again, waiting while the client changes into dry clothing. We should picture these workers neither as quaint seaside ornaments nor as automatic parts of the machinery. They were people making judgments in an environment that would not hold still. The surviving images give them no full payroll, no complete set of life stories, and no universal method. They give us something quieter, bodies braced against water, hands offered at the right height, and labor woven into a visitor's experience. When the machines are later remembered, the visitor's brief plunge can seem like the whole event. For an attendant, it was one instance in a working day. Another door would open. Another foot would seek the first wet step. Beyond the worker stood not only the sea, but the resort's attempts to order who could bathe, where they could do it, what they should wear, and how different groups should be kept apart. Those attempts were sometimes written down and displayed where wind, salt, and every passing visitor could read them. A notice board on a beach is a curious meeting between permanence and weather. Its message wants to be firm. The wood beneath it fades, its edges roughen, salt settles upon the surface. People pass in wet clothing or holiday dress, perhaps pausing to read before they decide where to go. The sea beyond obeys none of the lettering, but the human shore is being divided and managed. There was no single nationwide code that made every English bathing beach operate alike. The evidence considered here is local, and it will remain local. Yarmouth gives us one concrete notice. Scarborough gives us a separate group of bylaws and later provisions. Together they show resort authorities addressing similar questions, but they do not create a national chronology or authorize us to fill in the rules of towns not named. At Yarmouth, a surviving notice warned of a penalty of 40 shillings for bathing outside a machine or hut on specified parts of the beach. The force of the notice lies in its precision. It names a consequence and ties permitted bathing to particular equipment and particular beach areas. We need not turn that amount into a modern comparison or speculate about every prosecution. The notice itself tells us that unregulated entry into the water was considered serious enough to discourage with a stated penalty. A bathing machine, in this context, was more than a convenience rented by a shy visitor. It became part of the local ordering of the shore. To bathe in the approved way could mean using a recognized structure in a recognized place. The cabin made the bather more private, but it also made bathing more visible to those administering the beach. Machines could be arranged, watched, and associated with designated zones in a way that scattered individuals could not. 40 shillings would have sounded definite to a contemporary reader. Yet a posted penalty does not reveal how consistently it was imposed. Some notices are obeyed, some negotiated, some ignored, and some chiefly express an authority's desired order. We know the rule existed in this form. We do not know, from that fact alone, the private decision of every Yarmouth bather who encountered it. Move north in thought to Scarborough, and the local picture becomes more detailed. Bathing bylaws from around 1861 included a ban on naked bathing. They also restricted bathing in part of the shore to machines. Areas were set aside for men's and women's machines. These provisions tell us that the authorities were organizing bodies, equipment, and geography together. The ban on naked bathing belongs to Scarborough. It should not be enlarged into the claim that all English beaches prohibited nudity in 1861, nor into the opposite claim that all other beaches permitted it. Its value is more exact. At this resort, at about this date, naked bathing had become a subject of local prohibition. The rule gives a boundary against which actual custom was expected to arrange itself. Requiring machines in part of the shore created a second boundary. One stretch of beach could carry expectations different from another. A visitor needed local knowledge, whether acquired from a notice, an operator, an attendant, or simple observation. The open coast, apparently continuous to the eye, had been mapped into social spaces that were not visible in the sand itself. Then there was separation by gender. Areas assigned to men's and women's machines made the vehicles markers within a larger pattern. A machine did not simply roll from dry sand to water wherever convenient. Its proper position could depend upon the category of bathers it served. Rows of cabins thus expressed a local moral geography. Here one group prepared and entered, there another did so, with distance intended to preserve prevailing ideas of propriety. Later Scarborough bylaws required bathers of opposite sexes to remain 25 yards apart. The measured distance is striking because it tries to give etiquette a physical quantity. 25 yards can be paced, observed, disputed, and restored. Waves may move bathers without asking permission, and a busy sea is not easy to measure, but the rule translated a social concern into space. We should not imagine an official standing in the water with a measuring line between every pair. Nor should we assume the provision worked perfectly. Rules reveal intention more reliably than complete obedience. The 25 yards show how Scarborough attempted to maintain separation. They do not show that every moving person remained at precisely that interval. Clothing entered the bylaws too. Males over 12 were to wear suitable drawers, while females were to wear gowns. The age threshold made a distinction within the male population, and the garment terms established a minimum local expectation without giving us one exact pattern. The same caution used in the previous chapter matters here. These are Scarborough requirements, not a catalogue of universal English dress. Yarmouth and Scarborough need not have arrived at identical arrangements, and the surviving evidence does not suggest that they did. Yarmouth's notice gives a penalty attached to bathing outside a machine or hut in specified areas. Scarborough's local history supplies prohibitions, machine zones, gendered areas, dress requirements, and a later measured separation. The differences matter. Local government responds to local shorelines, existing customs, political pressures, and the practical form of each resort. Dates must also remain attached to their proper claims. Scarborough's bylaws around 1861 cannot be used to declare what Scarborough had always done, and later rules cannot be pushed backward into the earlier century. Nor does Yarmouth's notice set the timetable for Scarborough. Historical beaches changed through revisions, complaints, habits, and new expectations, not through one English command issued from above. By 1908, Scarborough was reported as having special facilities for mixed bathing. That later detail belongs to the same local story, but it should not be treated as a sudden national liberation or proof that all separation had vanished. A facility can create an option while older practices continue nearby. Mixed bathing could be accommodated in a defined way rather than simply dissolving every boundary across the beach. The weathered notice board has now accumulated several layers in our minds. One layer concerns equipment, machine or hut. Another concerns the body, nakedness, drawers, gowns. Another concerns location, this part of the beach, men's areas, women's areas, a measured distance, or later provision for mixed bathing. Together they show that privacy at the seaside was built from more than curtains. It was also built from words and spaces. Leave the two towns distinct as we step away. At Yarmouth, the surviving voice is a notice threatening a 40-shilling penalty within specified areas. At Scarborough, local bylaws around 1861 and later provisions reveal a more extended effort to govern nudity, machine use, gendered space, clothing, and distance, followed eventually by special mixed bathing facilities. Nothing here proves what every English resort required. It proves something more useful. The seaside was locally negotiated, and the strange wheeled cabins could become instruments of civic order. Far from these public rows and posted instructions, one machine survives with a very particular owner and setting. Its story does not belong to a municipal bathing ground crowded with anonymous visitors. It waits instead at Osborne, associated with Queen Victoria and a private royal shore. At Osborne on the Isle of Wight, the bathing machine associated with Queen Victoria survives as an object that can be examined rather than merely imagined from a distant print. It is tempting, in the presence of royalty, to let the story grow grand. Better to begin with the wood. The structure is a small cabin on wheels. It has a door and a little window. At the opposite end are steps, arranged for descent, and curtains that shielded the queen as she went toward the water. These familiar components connect it to the broader family of bathing machines, yet this particular combination belongs to this particular object. It is not a blueprint from which every resort cabin can be reconstructed. Its survival changes the quality of attention. In an image, a will may be partly hidden in sand and a curtain simplified by the artist. With an extant machine, the proportions of door, wall, window, and undercarriage can be considered together. One can see that the bather entered an actual confined room, not an abstract symbol of Victorian modesty. The machine carried weight. Its steps had edges. Its curtains occupied space when folded and had to be arranged when used. The decorated appearance is equally worth noticing. This was not merely a rough utility box hurried together for a public beach. Its ornaments suited an elite setting and a royal user. Decoration, however, does not change the basic practical problem. Queen and ordinary visitor alike had to pass from dry clothing to bathing clothing, from cabin to steps, and from stable ground toward water. Rank could refine the arrangements without abolishing gravity, damp cloth, or cold sea. Osborne was a private retreat rather than a typical commercial resort shore. That distinction keeps the object in focus. A royal household could organize access, attendance, privacy, maintenance, and timing in ways unavailable to a visitor joining a public row of machines. The quiet private beach did not need to accommodate every stranger who arrived with a fee. Therefore, what the machine tells us about elite bathing cannot simply be carried over to Yarmouth, Scarborough, or any unnamed town. Imagine it standing before use, the curtains folded and the steps dry. The little window admits enough light to reveal the interior. Outside, the shore lies within a managed estate landscape. There is no need to invent a conversation or a dramatic incident. The object itself supplies the scene, a royal household taking the curious technology of seaside privacy and adapting it to a sovereign's personal use. Queen Victoria's association gives the machine historical prominence, but prominence can distort. It might suggest that bathing machines were imposed upon society from the top, copied by everyone after a royal example. The evidence does not support that story. Machines and sea bathing practices had histories beyond this one owner. Osborne offers a documented elite case within that larger history, not the origin of the custom and not its universal form. At the seaward end, steps carried the body downward. Their presence is one of the secure details of the surviving machine. We should not embellish them with a precise universal number or claim that all machines place steps in exactly the same way. Here, they belong opposite the door, establishing a passage through the structure, enter from one side, change within, leave toward the water from the other. Curtains extended privacy beyond the hard walls. They shielded the Queen's descent, creating a flexible boundary where timber could not follow. Fabric could be drawn or arranged, then folded back. It moved with the air and required handling. A decorated shade or covering could also give the practical screen a suitably finished appearance. The royal machine thus combined mechanism, enclosure, textile, and ornament in one carefully managed object. The machine also depended on people. Someone maintained it, positioned it, attended the process, and cared for the fabric and wood after exposure to salt and damp. The Royal Association can pull attention toward the famous bather and away from those tasks. But no wheeled cabin moved or preserved itself. Even at Osborne, perhaps especially at Osborne, smooth use implied organized labor behind the quiet exterior. We do not need named servants or reconstructed remarks to recognize that labor. A wheel had to turn, a curtain had to be ready, wet steps had to remain fit for another use. The machine's survival may make it seem static, as museum objects often do, but its original meaning was motion and repeated preparation. It was a room intended to travel a short, significant distance. Royal bathing also illuminates the prestige of seaside practice. The sea had become a setting in which health, leisure, privacy, and status could meet. Medical claims surrounding seawater belong to historical theories and should not be repeated as modern truth. Still, an elite household's willingness to maintain specialized equipment shows that bathing was not a fringe curiosity. It could be incorporated into royal domestic life. There is a gentle absurdity in every bathing machine, and royalty does not remove it. A small house has acquired wheels. A person enters clothed for land and waits while the room approaches water. Furniture, fashion, engineering, and waves meet in a contrivance both solemn and faintly comic. The Osborne object allows us to acknowledge that strangeness without mocking the people who found it useful. Time has altered its function. The wheels no longer carry the queen to bathe. Curtains that once answered an immediate need are now evidence of that need. Decorated surfaces once seen within a working household have become historical details inspected by later eyes. Survival turns use into testimony. What, then, can this royal machine safely represent? It demonstrates that Queen Victoria had access to a purpose-built wheeled cabin at Osborne, that this surviving example includes a door, small window, steps at the opposite end, and curtains shielding descent, and that an elite version could be decorated and carefully arranged. It cannot prove that all upper-class bathers followed one ritual, that all machines looked like it, or that public resorts copied its exact design. Keeping those limits does not diminish the object. It lets the machine remain itself. We can stand before it, in thought, and notice folded curtains, quiet steps, woodwork, and a compact interior. We can place it on its private shore without filling the scene with unsupported ceremony. A royal name brings us to the object returns us to ordinary bodily concerns. Soon the cabin door closes again. For one person, whether sovereign or visitor, there is still the private business of changing. For workers outside, there is still positioning and waiting. For the body, there is still the moment when a dry foot meets a damp step. In the next chapter we will bring these established elements together, not as the recovered diary of a real individual, but as a carefully labeled possibility, one slow morning that might have happened in more than one English resort, while belonging exactly to none. What follows is a plausible composite reconstruction, not the documented morning of a named bather. No single diary preserves this exact morning, but the objects and practices in it are drawn from the evidence we have already examined. Local arrangements varied. There was no universal hire price, no universal session duration, and no single sequence followed at every resort. A morning might unfold like this. The first decision is made on dry sand. A visitor has come down from the lodging streets while the beach is still only moderately busy. Ahead stand several wooden cabins on wheels, their shadows angled across the ground. An operator or attendant is nearby. Somewhere there may be a notice explaining where bathing is permitted, although the wording would depend upon the town. Our invented visitor reads no imaginary quotation. They simply look, wait, and make it known that they wish to bathe. The terms of hire are left unstated. In one place and year, payment and timing may have been managed differently from another. There is no safe national sum to place in the visitor's hand and no standard number of minutes to promise them. Perhaps a machine is assigned immediately, perhaps there is a short wait. The reconstruction requires only that access be arranged before the visitor enters. The visitor steps in and the door closes. Beach sounds become duller rather than disappearing. Wheels grind elsewhere. Voices lose their clear edges. Through the small window comes pale morning light, laying a square upon the interior. The cabin smells of dry wood over older dampness. Street clothing must now be removed and kept safe. Exactly what the visitor wears depends upon gender, means, fashion, and date, none of which we will define too narrowly. One layer is folded, then another. Fastenings that were easy in a bedroom require more care in the small compartment. The cleanest part of the bench is reserved for what must remain dry. A bathing garment is put on. It is substantial enough to satisfy the expectations of this imagined setting, but it is not presented as the English costume. If our visitor is a woman, it might broadly resemble the covering gowns documented in the period. If a man, suitable drawers might answer a local rule like Scarborough's. We need not decide. What matters is the contrast between dry cloth prepared for water and the ordinary clothes now folded away. Then movement begins. How the machine is moved varies beyond the boundaries of this scene. We will not declare that every cabin was drawn by a horse, hauled by a rope, or pushed by people. We hear the consequence rather than naming an unsupported mechanism. The wheels turn, the floor tilts slightly over uneven sand, and the small room travels toward the water. The sound outside changes first. Dry sand gives way to firmer ground and then to shallows. Water reaches the wheels with a hush and withdrawal. Another small adjustment places the seaward steps where descent is practicable. The machine settles. An attendant signals that it is time, though we invent no words. The seaward exit is opened. If this machine has curtains, they offer screening around the descent. Not all machines did, and even here fabric cannot create perfect stillness. It lifts slightly in the moving air. Daylight enters more strongly than it did through the window. The upper step is dry enough. The next is darker with spray. The visitor places one foot carefully and reaches toward a rail, a frame, or the attendant's offered support. We do not prescribe the exact handhold because designs varied. A steady human arm is the surest element. At the lower tread, water washes around the feet. Cold arrives without the need for dramatic language. It is simply immediate, different from air, and difficult to ignore. The bathing cloth begins to darken where it is wet. A hem shifts with the retreating wave. The attendant watches the next wash approach. Experience of this sure matters now. The visitor can feel the steps but may not yet understand the rhythm of the water. A gesture says wait. Then another says move. They descend together until the sea carries some of the body's weight. The garment that seemed orderly inside the cabin changes character. Cloth clings in one place and floats in another. Water pulls at folds. The visitor concentrates on footing while the attendant maintains a balanced stance. If this bathing has been recommended as part of a historical health regimen, the visitor may understand the immersion through the medical beliefs of the time. Those beliefs are not modern advice, and this scene does not validate them. To the person within the reconstruction, however, the sea may represent treatment as well as recreation. Expectation shapes the experience, a plunge endured because it is thought-strengthening, refreshing, or beneficial according to contemporary ideas. We will not turn the attendant into a legendary dipper or describe a universal dunking method. Assistance might be firmer or lighter according to client and place. Here, the worker helps the visitor pass safely beyond the steps and complete a brief immersion. The event is practical, not theatrical. A wave rises to the waist. The visitor draws breath. Another moves past with less surprise. Perhaps they make a few motions resembling swimming, perhaps they remain close to support. Many kinds of confidence came to the shore, and our composite person need not become suddenly expert. No clock tells us when the visitor must turn back. Session lengths could vary, and cold, conditions, local practice, and individual preference all mattered. We therefore allow only an unspecified interval. It is long enough for the purpose of the bath, short enough that the attendant and visitor remain attentive to the return. Then the attendant guides the visitor toward the steps. Return can be less alarming because the route is known, but it is not automatically easier. Wet clothing is heavier. Legs must rise against water. The lowest tread may be briefly hidden by a wave. A hand finds support. One foot meets timber, then the other. The worker braces while the visitor climbs. Water runs from the garment and taps upon the steps. Behind the curtains, if they are present, the open beach is screened again, though the sounds of other activity remain close. The visitor crosses the threshold and enters the cabin. The seaward opening closes. Almost at once, the interior feels warmer, not because it is truly warm, but because the wind no longer strikes the wet cloth directly. The little room that seemed cramped before now feels protective. There is no elegant way to remove saturated garments. A fastening resists. A sleeve turns partly inside out. The visitor keeps one foot away from the folded dry clothes while trying to manage the other. Water gathers on the boards and carries grains of sand into narrow corners. A dry cloth or whatever local arrangement provides for drying would be welcome, but we should not invent a universal set of amenities. The visitor does what can be done, then reaches for the garments preserved on the bench. Dry fabric touches chilled skin. Layer by layer, the ordinary person of the street reappears. Outside, the machine is moved back toward the upper shore. Again, we do not specify the means as though it applied everywhere. The wheels turn, water falls away from them, the floor rocks gently. Inside, the visitor may still be fastening clothing as the cabin travels, or movement may wait until changing is complete. Both sequence and timing could differ. Our composite morning chooses only a calm return. The sound under the wheels grows rougher as sand dries. The square of light shifts across the wall. Wet bathing clothes occupy one side of the small interior, dry street clothes the body. Salt remains in the hair and at the edges of the skin. When the cabin stops, the landward door opens upon the beach. The visitor steps down, perhaps with a trace of stiffness, perhaps refreshed according to their own expectation. They have traveled only a short distance, yet crossed several social boundaries, public shore to private room, dry clothing to bathing dress, land to water, and back again. Nor does the visitor's payment, whatever it was, tell the whole cost of the morning. The system required construction, maintenance, labor, storage, and an organized portion of beach. Local rules might define its location. Clothing represented further work. The apparently simple act of bathing rested upon many hands and materials. Our visitor turns toward the town. Behind them, another person may approach the row, while an attendant checks the steps or waits beside a door. Nothing singular has happened. That ordinariness is the point. A strange-looking machine became useful by making a repeatable passage between the values of the shore and the physical facts of the sea. Let us state the limits once more before the imagined morning dissolves. This has been a plausible composite, assembled from established features of bathing machine use. It is not a claim that every bather hired a machine in the same manner, paid the same price, remained in the water for the same duration, or the same garment, received the same assistance, or followed these stages in precisely this order. Resorts, periods, operators, and individuals differed. What the composite offers is not a universal schedule but a way of feeling how the parts fit together. The door provided privacy. The bench protected dry clothing. Wheels brought the room toward water. Steps made descent possible. Curtains, where used, extended the screen. An attendant could steady the uncertain body. Clothing answered custom and sometimes local regulation. The return restored the bather to the public beach. By late morning, the sand bears will tracks running down toward the shallows and back again. They overlap with footprints until no single journey can be followed. The cabins remain, square and patient, while the resort gathers around them. Above the beach are lodgings, shops, guides, promenades, and many other pieces of seaside life. Our one reconstructed visitor disappears among them, leaving the machine ready to become, for a little while, someone else's private room. A bathing machine never truly stood alone. Even when an old image places one cabin against a broad emptiness of sand and sky, the little structure belonged to a much larger arrangement. Someone had built it and maintained it. Someone brought it toward the water and helped the person within. The bather had come from somewhere, perhaps from lodgings only a short walk away, perhaps after a longer journey. Beyond the frame of the image there were meals to be served, rooms to be aired, directions to be given, clothing to be dried, and visitors to be entertained when their brief encounter with the sea was over. So, after following one imagined morning of bathing, we can widen our view. The machine remains near the middle of the picture, its wheels resting in the sand, but around it an entire resort begins to appear. This did not happen at one moment or according to one plan. English seaside towns developed at different speeds and from different beginnings. Some already had lives shaped by fishing, trade, or other local work. Sea bathing became one strand within those older places, and as visitors arrived for health, fashion, curiosity, or pleasure, that strand was woven into a growing coastal economy. The medical fashion of the 18th century helped direct attention toward the shore. Physicians promoted sea water for many complaints according to the theories of their own time, and guidebooks helped travelers imagine the coast as a destination. These beliefs are part of the history, not advice for us now. Yet they had practical consequences then. A recommendation to take the sea required more than sea water. The patient or visitor needed transport, a place to stay, food, information, assistance, and some means of entering the water while observing the customs of the resort. The bathing machine answered only one part of that need. Its importance becomes clearer when we see all the other services gathered around it. Begin with lodging. A visitor could not experience the shore as a temporary resident without a bed and a room. The growth of sea bathing therefore brought opportunity to people who let rooms, kept lodging houses, prepared meals, washed linen, carried baggage, or supplied households. We need not invent a single typical lodging house, for accommodations varied as much as visitors did. It is enough to notice the connection. Every occupied room represented work performed away from the beach, and every morning departure toward the water linked that private interior to the public shore. Printed guides belonged to this system too. The existence of 18th and early 19th century travel literature associated with bathing resorts reminds us that visitors needed the coast to be made legible. A guide could describe routes and places, direct attention, and turn scattered amenities into a destination that could be anticipated before arrival. We should not use the mere existence of a guide to supply details we have not checked. But we can recognize what guidebooks did in broad terms. They carried an idea of the resort inland. They offered the prospective traveler a paper version of the coast, ordered, named, and ready to be visited. Once at the shore, the visitor encountered another kind of order. The machines might be placed in rows or groups according to local arrangements. Notices could mark expected conduct. Attendants linked the dry beach to the changing cabin and the surf. The visual effect was curious and unmistakable, domestic-looking little rooms brought out onto open sand. Their presence announced that bathing was not simply an impulsive dash into the water. It had become an organized service, fitted into hours of work and habits of respectability. Around that service, the visitor's day could expand. The sea bath itself might be brief, but a stay at the coast was longer. There was time before and after it, time to walk, to look outward from the shore, to meet others, to read, dine, rest, or observe the passing scene. Promenades and piers belong to the larger history of the resort as places where the coast could be enjoyed without entering the sea at all. We will not attach unverified dates to particular structures. Instead, let us consider their different relationship to the water. The bathing machine carried a covered private room down toward the waves. The promenade made the edge of the land into a social route. A pier, where present, extended the visitor's path outward above the water. Each gave a different way of approaching the same marine horizon. This is where the machine becomes a useful visual center. Below, wheels press into sand and attendants work close to the water. Above or behind, footsteps pass along a more formal public space. One activity depends upon privacy, another depends upon being seen. The resort contains both. A bather disappears inside a cabin to change, while walkers display their outdoor dress and take in the company. The shore is at once screened and sociable, practical and theatrical. Those apparent opposites helped give the seaside its distinctive character. The beach could be treated as a place of health and as a place of amusement, as a work site and as scenery, as an open natural margin and as a space governed by custom. No single motive replaced all the others. A person might arrive carrying a physician's recommendation and still enjoy a walk. Another might value society more than therapy. Over time, the language of pleasure could sit beside the older language of health. The same town could accommodate different expectations, though never equally for every visitor. As more visitors came, space on the shore had to be negotiated. Bathing areas, machines, workers, walkers, and other activities occupied the same shifting boundary. The local notices and bylaws considered earlier show that at least some towns tried to regulate where and how bathing took place. Those examples cannot be turned into a single national system. What they reveal is that the resort beach was not an unclaimed blank. It was arranged through local decisions, customs, and disagreements. The machine participated in that arrangement by making bathing visible as an organized activity while concealing the bather at selected moments. By keeping the machine in view, we avoid telling the story of resort growth as a simple march from emptiness to development. The shore was never merely empty, and the visitor economy did not erase older local lives. Nor did every resort acquire the same amenities in the same order. What we can safely see is an expanding network of relationships. Medical fashion encouraged journeys. Travel writing described destinations. Lodgings held visitors overnight. Workers enabled bathing. Promenades and piers broadened the possible seaside day. Local rules attempted to order shared space. The cabin on wheels connected these elements because it stood exactly where private need met public business. Late in the morning, the beach may be busier than it was at dawn. The machine that once seemed solitary now belongs to a moving background of people and services. Its door closes, footsteps pass above, a guidebook waits in a lodging room drawer, damp clothing is carried away from the shore. Nothing in this scene needs to happen everywhere in precisely this form. It is the broad pattern that matters. The act of bathing became embedded in the life of a resort. And behind the growth of that resort lay the question of access. Who could reach the coast, how often, from how far away, and at what expense. Long before rails arrived, travelers were already making their way to seaside destinations. Yet during the 19th century the railway altered the scale and rhythm of many journeys. To understand that change, we must leave the wheels on the beach for a moment and listen for another set of wheels approaching from inland. The sound is different from the low turn of a bathing machine. It comes from beyond the town, along a fixed route, metal, steam, motion, and arrival. In the 19th century, railway connections expanded access to many coastal resorts and helped bring larger flows of visitors. That statement is important, but it needs to be held carefully. Railways did not discover the sea, invent sea bathing, or create every resort from nothing. By the time trains reached parts of the coast, seaside destinations had already been developing for decades through medical fashion, road travel, lodging, guidebooks, and the work of local communities. So there is no empty before and instant after. There is, instead, an older resort world into which the railway entered. Picture the bathing machine already standing on the shore. Its form belongs to habits established before mass rail travel. The changing cabin, the attendant, the local rules, and the idea of a journey for sea bathing did not wait for a locomotive to make them imaginable. What rail access could do was alter who might make that journey, how the movement of visitors was organized, and how many arrivals a town might prepare to receive. We will avoid naming town-specific opening dates, since dates must be verified place by place and are not needed for the larger point. Railway development was uneven. Different coastlines and resorts were connected at different times. Some places benefited more directly than others. A rail line was not a universal switch thrown across England. It was a network extended in stages, meeting existing local histories wherever it arrived. Before rail travel, reaching a resort required other forms of transport and often more time. The existence of early travel guides reminds us that people did make such journeys. Their presence matters because it prevents an easy but misleading story in which the inland population suddenly noticed the coast only when tracks appeared. Visitors already knew of seaside cures and resorts. Roads, vehicles, money, leisure, social ties, and printed information already shaped travel. The railway joined these conditions. It did not replace history with a new beginning. Yet the change in access could be profound. Rail travel connected inland points to coastal destinations in a new transport system. Arrivals could be grouped by timetables. Luggage, clothing, expectations, and crowds came toward the station rather than filtering into town only by older routes. The resort had to meet the movement. Lodgings, streets, food supplies, and entertainments all existed in relation to guests whose journey now followed rails for at least part of the way. At the water's edge, the bathing machine could continue to perform its familiar role. This coexistence is revealing. A modern transport technology delivered visitors to an older-looking wooden cabin whose purpose was to preserve changing privacy and manage descent into the sea. The two machines belonged to different scales. One moved many people over long distances on fixed tracks. The other moved one enclosed bather a short distance over sand. Together they show how change often works, not by replacing every old practice at once, but by placing new systems around practices that remain useful. The railway could enlarge the audience for the seaside without making that audience socially uniform. Access was always shaped by resources and opportunity. A connection on a map did not mean that every person could travel, stay, hire services, or take leisure in the same way. Nor did all visitors seek the same experience once they arrived. The history of increased access should therefore not be flattened into a claim that the coast suddenly became equally available to everyone. What changed was the possibility and scale of movement, within the inequalities and constraints of the period. This layered development helps explain why the machine did not disappear as soon as trains arrived. Railway access addressed distance, the bathing machine addressed conduct at the shore. One got people to the coast. The other offered a place to change and a screened or regulated route into the water. As long as local expectations made that service useful, faster travel alone gave no reason to remove it. Indeed, a busier resort might sustain more organized bathing services for a time. Nor should infrastructure be mistaken for a single cause of cultural change. Railways mattered alongside rising interest in leisure, existing resort promotion, available lodging, local investment, habits of holidaymaking, and the reputation of particular places. The broad social history of English resorts is one of interacting forces. If we say only that, the railway created the seaside, we lose the physicians and guidebooks of the 18th century, the pre-rail travelers, the lodging keepers, attendants, local authorities, and coastal residents who had already made the shore into a destination. We also lose the agency of the towns themselves. A railway did not produce identical results wherever it ran. A resort received, adapted to, promoted, or struggled with access according to local circumstances. The beach itself might be ordered by distinct customs and rules. The same national transport network could therefore lead travelers toward shores that remained locally particular. For the bathing machine, increased visitation may be understood without unsupported numbers. More important than a dramatic statistic is the visible relationship. Machines stand at a shore visited by people arriving through a widening network. Their continued presence indicates that technological modernity and older privacy conventions coexisted. The picturesque cabin was not outside the modern resort economy. It was one of its working parts. Imagine, then, not a railway sweeping the old coast away, but lines of connection drawing toward it. At one end are inland homes and stations, at the other, lodging streets, promenades, and a beach. The traveler passes from carriage to town, from town to shore, and perhaps from ordinary clothing into bathing dress inside a wheeled wooden room. Each transition has its own space and its own helpers. The whole journey is more than the train ride, just as the whole resort is more than the beach. Over the later 19th century and into the early 20th, however, the people arriving at the coast encountered changing expectations. Clothing altered. The public presence of bathers became more acceptable in some places. Demands for mixed bathing re-emerged from the 1890s, according to the English evidence available to us, but acceptance developed unevenly. Scarborough offers one local sign in its reported special facilities by 1908. These changes were not delivered by the railway, though greater visitor flows formed part of the wider resort setting in which customs were debated and revised. The train, then, is best left at the station rather than made the hero of every seaside story. It expanded access and could increase the movement of visitors. It helped reshape the scale and rhythm of resort life. But the shore had a past before it arrived, and change after arrival still depended on clothing, work, local rules, and public expectations. When we return now to the beach, we will find that the most decisive change for the bathing machine did not come simply from how people reached the coast. It came from how they expected to appear once they were there. Privacy at the seaside was never one fixed thing. In the earlier world of the bathing machine, it could mean a wooden room in which street clothes were removed, a curtain or awning near the seaward steps, separation between groups of bathers, or rules limiting where bathing could occur. These arrangements made an exposed shore behave, for a few moments, like an interior. But they depended on local custom, clothing, gender convention, and public expectation. When those surrounding conditions changed, the meaning of privacy changed with them. The change was gradual. There was no single national day on which mixed bathing was suddenly accepted, no one law that opened every English beach, and no universal moment when the curtain became unnecessary. Resorts followed different paths. Even within one town, written rules, facilities, and ordinary behavior might not shift together. We should imagine overlapping practices rather than a clean dividing line. Clothing was central to this transition because it altered what could be seen in public without necessarily altering the desire for modesty itself. Earlier chapters have already shown that bathing dress varied by place, gender, class, and decade. Scarborough's local evidence gives one late 19th century description involving shoulder frills and white stripes, while later costumes there were reported as less concealing after the First World War. Such examples are useful precisely because they are local. They show visible change without giving us permission to dress every English bather alike. By the 1890s, sufficiently covering swimwear and a growing acceptance of crossing the beach while wearing it reduced the need for a private mobile route all the way to the water in some places. That is a subtle but important shift. Privacy did not vanish. Changing still required a space. Bodies were still governed by expectations. But the location of the boundary could move. Instead of remaining concealed from street clothes to sea, a swimmer might change in a tent or other shelter and then cross open sand in bathing dress. The bathing machine had been designed around movement. Its cabin joined changing room and transport, carrying privacy toward the water. Once it became acceptable for a suitably clothed swimmer to walk from a fixed changing place to the sea, those two functions could separate. The changing room could remain on dry ground. The bather could move independently across the beach. A machine's wheels, once essential to its particular solution, were no longer always necessary. This should not be told as a simple victory of freedom over restraint. Every period had its own rules of appearance, and newer bathing garments were still judged for suitability. The public beach remained a social space in which people watched one another and interpreted conduct. What altered was the acceptable form of visibility. A covered swimmer on the sand could gradually become ordinary where an earlier convention had required a screened descent. Mixed bathing changed the arrangement further. When men and women entered the water in shared areas, older systems of strict separation became less workable or less desired. Yet even here the evidence asks for patience. A Brighton-focused historical account says that beachgoers demanded mixed bathing again from the 1890s. Scarborough is reported to have had special facilities for mixed bathing by 1908, alongside Blackpool and Margate. These statements do not establish one national chronology. They show that change was being requested, negotiated, and accommodated in particular places. Local bylaws make the contrast especially clear. Around 1861, Scarborough's bathing rules reportedly included a ban on naked bathing, areas for men's and women's machines, and requirements for particular forms of covering. Later rules also maintained distance between opposite-sex bathers. By 1908, the same local history reports special mixed bathing facilities. This does not mean that every resident or visitor changed opinion at once. It means that within one resort, over time, regulation and provision reflected more than one phase of beach conduct. For the individual bather, that rearrangement could alter the emotional geography of the shore. Inside the machine, privacy had been made from boards, a door, and perhaps curtains. Outside, the open beach represented a distance to be crossed under public eyes. As bathing dress became more acceptable on the sand, that distance could feel less like an exposure to be avoided and more like part of the seaside experience. The walk itself became visible. The beach around 1900, in the evidence available to us, can therefore be imagined as mixed in more than one sense. Movable machines and fixed canvas tents could stand within the same resort world. Some swimmers crossed the sand in bathing clothes. Some may still have used the older mobile cabin. Areas and expectations differed. The shore held the past and the emerging practice together. Privacy also had a practical side that outlasted the machine. Clothes, belongings, wind, and weather still made shelter desirable. The issue was not whether bathers needed any private place, but whether that place had to move into the water. Fixed tents answered the first need without answering the second. Their increasing presence marks a transfer of function rather than the end of modesty. The public acceptance of swimwear on the beach also changed what the resort displayed. Earlier, the machine itself was the visible sign of bathing while the changed bather remained largely screened. Later, clothed swimmers could become part of the visible beach crowd. The focus shifted from the wheeled cabin to the people moving between changing place and water. Privacy was drawn more narrowly around the act of changing, leaving the approach to the sea in public view. This visual shift mattered to the atmosphere of the shore. A line of cabins suggested controlled passages into the water. A busier beach of walkers and swimmers suggested a more continuous social space. Yet the older and newer scenes were not separated by a locked door. Curtains could be used less often before machines vanished. Wheels could remain even when a cabin moved less. A fixed tent could stand near a mobile machine. Mixed bathing could be provided in one area while other conventions continued elsewhere. Scarborough and Brighton help us see pieces of this process, but neither can stand for every English coast. The right conclusion is modest. From the late 19th century, demands and expectations concerning mixed bathing and public bathing dress were changing. In the early 20th century, resorts could provide both old and new forms. The pace and details were local. Anything more uniform would smooth away the evidence we actually possess. By allowing the transition to remain uneven, we can better understand why no single end of the bathing machine will do. Its decline followed not one decree but a weakening of the need for mobile privacy. Clothing changed. Crossing the beach in swimwear became acceptable in some settings. Mixed bathing gained provision in particular resorts. Fixed shelters offered another place to change. Each development removed a little of the machine's special purpose, but none had to remove every machine immediately. Now the curtain at the seaward end carries less of the story than it once did. Beyond it, bathers are already visible on the sand. The cabin remains, weathered but serviceable, while a canvas tent stands farther up the beach. To follow what happened next, we need not search for a dramatic final journey. We can look instead at how movable cabins, fixed shelters, converted huts, replicas, and surviving objects became entangled, and how carefully each must be named. At Osborne there is a bathing machine associated with Queen Victoria that survives as an object. It gives us a firm place to begin because it can be examined rather than reconstructed from a vague memory. Its door, small window, steps at the opposite end, and curtains shielding descent show one documented arrangement. Its decorated character belongs to this particular royal example. It must not be treated as the standard from which every resort machine was copied. A surviving object has a quiet authority, but it also asks careful questions. Which parts belong to its period of use? What has been repaired or preserved? What can one example tell us about a broad and varied practice? The Osborne machine securely demonstrates that such a structure could be built with these features and used in an elite setting. It cannot establish universal dimensions, decoration, propulsion, or routine. Survival narrows uncertainty in one direction while leaving many others open. This distinction becomes especially important near the end of the bathing machine's history. A small wooden hut beside the sea may resemble a machine, but resemblance is not a catalogue. It might be an original mobile cabin, a machine later altered, a purpose-built stationary hut, a reconstruction, or a modern replica. Without object records or other dependable evidence, we should not assign it a past merely because its outline feels familiar. The transition itself encouraged visual ambiguity. Around 1900, fixed canvas changing tents appeared alongside movable bathing machines in the English account available to us. During the early 20th century, both could be offered at the same beach. This was not necessarily a contest settled at once. Each structure answered a need. The tent provided a private place to change on land. The machine preserved the older possibility of carrying that privacy toward the water. A fixed tent made a different claim on the shore from a wheeled cabin. The machine was meant to move, at least in its defining use. Its wheels and axle allowed the changing room to travel. The tent accepted distance from the water and made the bather travel instead. That reversal seems small, but it captures the larger shift. Privacy stayed behind while the swimmer crossed the visible beach. Some machines persisted locally into the 1920s and 1930s. This is evidence of survival in use at certain resorts, not proof of a single national lifespan. It warns us against tidy endings. An object can disappear early in one place and remain familiar in another. A custom can become old-fashioned without becoming extinct. If one visitor encountered fixed tents while another resort still moved wooden cabins, both experiences belong to the same broad period of transition. Some bathing machines also had their wheels removed and became stationary huts. Here the object itself crossed the boundary between categories. The cabin remained, but its function changed. Once placed permanently on the beach, it could continue to offer shelter without carrying a bather into the sea. The mobile room became a fixed room. That adaptation made practical sense. The wooden enclosure still had value after movement ceased to be necessary. It could be reused rather than discarded. Yet it complicates any modern attempt to count or identify survivors. A converted hut may contain the material body of a bathing machine while no longer operating as one. To call it simply an original machine without explaining the conversion would conceal part of its history. To call it merely a beach hut might conceal the earlier one. Good naming preserves both phases where evidence supports them. Replicas present another kind of case. A replica can be useful for showing viewers how a machine may have looked or how its parts related. It can give scale and presence to an unfamiliar object. But it is a modern interpretation, not direct evidence that every detail existed in the past. Its paint, timber, curtains, wheels, and fittings may reflect informed choices, practical compromises, or visual expectations. The honest label is therefore simple and essential: replica. Museum display can make these distinctions easy to overlook. Once an object stands cleanly presented, with space around it and perhaps a painted coastal background, the categories of survival, restoration, conversion, and reconstruction can blur in the visitor's mind. A careful label restores the missing biography. It tells us whether wheels remained through continued use, were removed and later replaced, or belong to a new build, whether the structure came from a documented beach or was created to illustrate a type. We cannot provide such biographies without records, so we should resist supplying them from imagination. The Osborne machine is valuable partly because it anchors the story amid these uncertainties. We can return to its particular features and say, here is one surviving royal machine, not every machine. Its continued existence does not identify the last moment of the custom. Nor does its preservation imply that ordinary resort cabins shared its finish or circumstances. It is a specific survival from a diverse material world. This caution matters because the bathing machine attracts picturesque stories. Its strangeness to modern eyes encourages definitive captions: the first, the typical, the last, the inventor's design. But our evidence does not support those neat labels. The more truthful ending is a landscape of partial survivals. One documented royal object remains. Some ordinary machines lingered locally into the interwar years. Some lost their wheels and continued as huts. Fixed tents shared beaches with movable cabins. Replicas and reconstructions now help represent the form, provided they are named honestly. There is no need to identify one final machine rolling back from the sea. A national last would require evidence we do not have and might distort a practice that ended unevenly. Decline can be understood without a ceremonial endpoint. The service became less necessary as bathing clothes could be worn publicly on the beach, mixed bathing gained acceptance in some places, and fixed changing shelters served the remaining need for privacy. Machines then disappeared, persisted, or changed use according to local circumstances. The converted hut is perhaps the gentlest emblem of that process. Nothing dramatic happens. The wheels are removed. The cabin no longer makes its short journey. It stands on the sand and continues to shelter people in another way. Form survives while function settles into place. The object carries its earlier life quietly, whether later observers recognize it or not. That reversal brings us near the close of our shoreline journey. We began by wondering at a little room on wheels. We have now learned why identifying such a room is not always simple. Wood can outlast purpose. Wheels can vanish. New wheels can be added to a replica. Canvas tents can occupy the same transitional beach. The safest history stays close to documentation and leaves uncertain cabins unnamed. Let the Osborne machine remain where it is, particular and preserved. Let the converted huts retain both their lives when records allow. Let replicas be useful without pretending to be originals. And let the unverified silhouette in an old seaside memory remain a possibility rather than a fact. We do not lose wonder by making these distinctions. We gain a quieter, more durable kind of attention. There is now only one chapter left, and it will add nothing to the evidence. We will simply gather what we have already seen, the old medical fashion, the workers and rules, the traveling cabin, the changing resort, and the gradual shift from mobile privacy to other forms. Then the machine can return once more toward dry sand, not as the last of its kind, but as the familiar cabin with which our evening began. The shore is quieter now. The day's visitors have thinned, and the light rests softly on the boards of the bathing machine. We do not need another date, another rule, or another claim. Everything required for the story is already here. We can walk back through it slowly, gathering no new facts, only noticing how the pieces fit together. At first there was the curious shape itself, a small wooden cabin on wheels, though designs differed by place and period. A door opened into a changing space. A small window might admit a little light. At the seaward end, steps led down, and in some examples curtains or an awning screened the bather's descent. What looked from a distance like an unlikely cart was really a portable boundary between public sand and private preparation. The machine belonged to a time when the sea had acquired a medical reputation. 18th-century physicians promoted sea water for many conditions according to the medical ideas of their own age. We kept those claims in their historical place. They are not modern guidance. Their importance for us was that they helped turn attention toward coastal bathing and gave travelers a serious reason, as they understood it, to seek the shore. The coast was not waiting without a history. Resorts developed through travel, lodging, promotion, local work, and the older lives of seaside towns. Guidebooks helped describe destinations. Visitors found rooms and meals. Attendants prepared to help at the water. The bathing machine became one visible part of an economy that extended far beyond its wheels. Inside the cabin, ordinary clothing could be removed away from public view. Outside, the beach remained open and watchful. The machine carried privacy across that difficult space. It did not do so in one universal design or by one universal method. Exact arrangements varied. That variation has followed us throughout the story, keeping every local example from pretending to speak for the entire coast. Rules also stood behind the apparent simplicity of the scene. Local notices and bylaws could govern where bathing occurred, what covering was expected, or how groups were separated. Yarmouth and Scarborough gave us local evidence, not a national code. Their differences taught the same lesson as the differing machines. The English seaside was made from many local shores, each changing through its own decisions and customs. Railways later expanded access and helped increase visitor flows, but they did not create seaside culture alone. Resorts and bathing journeys existed before the rails reached them. The railway entered an established story and changed its scale and rhythm. It carried travelers toward the coast, where older forms of privacy could continue beside newer systems of movement. Then the boundary of acceptable visibility began to shift. Bathing clothes changed. In some places it became more acceptable for suitably clothed swimmers to cross the beach. Demands for mixed bathing reappeared, and particular resorts made local provision. There was no national switch and no single date. Older and newer expectations overlapped, as people and places adjusted at different speeds. That adjustment weakened the machine's unique purpose. If a bather could change on land and walk openly to the water in bathing dress, privacy no longer needed wheels. Fixed canvas tents could stand beside movable cabins. Some machines remained in use locally into the interwar years. Some had their wheels removed and became stationary huts. The change was not a sudden disappearance but a gradual separation of changing place from journey to the sea. All of these points return us to the same modest way of looking. The past is often most vivid when we do not force it into a perfect pattern. There was no one design, one rule, one railway effect, one mixed bathing date, or one final machine. There were cabins, workers, bathers, and local shores, changing clothes and changing expectations, objects reused, preserved, or recreated. Their unevenness is not a flaw in the story. It is the story's true shape. The little room on wheels now seems less strange than it did at the beginning. Its logic has become clear. On an open beach, it supplied enclosure. Within a health fashion, it supplied ritual. In a growing resort, it supplied a service. Under local rules, it helped arrange bodies in space. When public bathing dress and mixed bathing altered that arrangement, its wheels gradually mattered less. But we need not press the image for a grand conclusion. The people who used these machines were not performing history for us. They were preparing for the water according to the habits available to them. The attendants were doing their work. The lodging keepers were attending to rooms. The rules belonged to immediate local concerns. The objects became curious only as the world around them changed. Near the water, the bathing machine begins its short return. We will not call it the last. We will not choose a town or a year. It is simply the cabin we have followed all evening, rolling back from the line of the waves. Water darkens the lower wheels. Salt has dried along the boards. The curtain at the seaward door hangs almost still. The tracks behind the wheels are shallow. On firmer sand they remain for a while, nearer the water they soften quickly. That is enough of a final image. We do not need to make the sea erase history, for the surviving objects and records have kept part of it. Nor do we need the marks to remain forever. The cabin has already reached us through the evidence we have followed. Let the question settle now, why the sea was sought, how a person changed on an open shore, who helped, who regulated, how the resort expanded, and why the machine slowly ceased to be necessary. Each has been answered as far as our sources allow. The uncertainties can rest beside the answers. Nothing more needs to be solved tonight. The wheels turn once, then again, with no hurry in them. The cabin rises onto drier sand. Behind it, the water continues its low, even movement, drawing forward and slipping back. The sound does not explain or conclude. It simply continues. You may let the machine grow indistinct. Let the promenade, the tents, the station, and the lodging house windows soften with it. There is no need to hold the whole coast in view. One quiet line of water is enough. One small cabin resting above it is enough. The story has returned to where it began, the meeting of a wooden room and the sea. We understand the room now, but the sea needs no further history from us. It moves in the dark as it moved beyond every rule and railway, every curtain and changing garment, every day of work on the beach. So leave the wheels at rest. Leave the steps folded into shadow. Leave the door gently closed. The shore will keep its own soft rhythm, and you can drift beyond the need to listen closely. There is nothing else to remember. The cabin is safe on the sand. The evening is calm. The water advances, withdraws, and advances again, quietly enough to carry the last waking thought away. And as the old resort fades into night, let the sea remain, unhurried, low, and steady, moving at the edge of sleep.